Kia ora, ko whasmithaho. Ngā mai ki te whare, welcome to the House. Various countries are demonstrating a worrying trend in the exercise of government towards executive overreach, the degradation of democratic norms, and even moves towards authoritarianism. It's worrying to watch, and it makes you ask, what in our own democratic system guards against governments here wandering off down Despot Boulevard? Well, to help answer that question, I wandered across the street to Wellington's own law school to meet one of New Zealand's foremost constitutional scholars.
Kia ora, Dr. Dean Knight, Professor of Law at Te Herenga Waka, Victoria University, Wellington. It's such a big question, and it's a complicated answer, because you're really asking about how do we control power and executive power within our system here. We're an odd country with an unwritten constitution. We don't have that sort of master text supreme constitution that regulates the exercise of power very explicitly. We have what we might call a customary constitution, a multi-text constitution. Our rules and expectations are littered all over the place. Some of them written down in legislation, some of them written down in other important documents, some of them arise from just the practice and expectation about exercising power in a proper way. And I guess the distinctive thing about New Zealand is a lot of the checks and balances and controls on executive power in our system are political in character rather than legal and involving courts. So we position ourselves in a slightly different way than some other jurisdictions.
For example, you've got on the table here in front of you, perchance, because we're in one of the sort of discussion lounges at the law school, a copy of the Cabinet Manual, which is one small aspect of the Constitution of New Zealand.
Oh, absolutely, and we're very proud of it in New Zealand. It's something we've actually exported to the United Kingdom, who borrowed the idea of it from us. And what we have in that Cabinet Manual is essentially a collection of the existing constitutional conventions about how executive government, ministers and the Prime Minister and departments will exercise their power and run the state. So some very high fundamental constitutional conventions like the Cardinal Constitutional Convention that the Governor-General, the monarch's representative here, acts on advice of their responsible ministers, as long as those ministers maintain the confidence of the House of Representatives. A lot of the power is vested formally in the King, or the local representative, the Governor-General, but they don't actually make the decisions about that power. That's done by ministers, cabinet, who are drawn from our House of Representatives. And that Constitutional Convention builds the idea of democracy within our fundamental arrangements.
It's a very different one to many of the countries where we see change. For a start, our executive is part of our parliament. The executive always has to have the majority of the parliament.
Oh, and that's so crucial. Parliamentary system, the idea of responsible government, we draw our government from our elected representatives, creates a different way to distribute power and condition power and generates so many checks and balances. Confidence is the lifeblood that runs through the system. The government has to maintain the confidence of the House of Representatives in order to have the entitlement to govern. And if they lose that confidence, they lose the entitlement to govern.
Yeah, they're no longer the government. At the same time as that is potentially a guardrail, it is also a lot more power than most governments have, than non-parliamentary executives have, because they automatically have a majority. They automatically can pass whatever law they damn well please up to a point.
In the pre-MMP days, when we had first past the post, we did have times where we had a very dominant executive in the House of Representatives and able to get their bidding in terms of passing laws through the House. That era is described as an elected dictatorship or an executive paradise.
You're thinking as kind of Muldoon as the prime example of that.
That's right. And in New Zealand, our executive operates in a couple of different ways. One is by changing the legal settings and passing laws, and the other one is exercising executive or delegated power under legislation. A lot of what governments do here is pass laws to reshape the legal settings, and in order to do that, you've got to be able to persuade the House it's a good idea and it should be supported. But if you can whip all the numbers under a first past of the post where you've got a single party in power, easy to get that through. And that's why we celebrated MMP when it atomised that power. It took us to a period of multi-party government where a cabinet or a prime minister couldn't automatically assume that their program would get through the House, and they had to negotiate and do better to try and ensure they can get the sort of support for different initiatives.
So to some extent, MMP may be one of your guardrails.
Fundamentally, I think
because it tends to lead to coalitions rather than one-party power.
Yeah, and that sharing of power, that multi-party government brings in tensions and frictions and slows the process down and ideally removes excesses. The question we might want to ask is whether our parties have now mastered the system such that we're returning to a time at which the government can quite confidently just push everything through and there isn't that contestation on a sort of policy by policy basis.
In many countries, the first obstacle that a wannabe authoritarian has to deal with is the courts. Because in many countries, there'll be a constitutional court or a Supreme Court or something rather that goes, no, sorry, you can't do that. But in New Zealand, that doesn't really exist, does it?
Our system of parliamentary sovereignty means laws that are passed by the Parliament prevail, and nobody can disapply the product of Parliament except in very unusual circumstances. But as a general proposition, the courts don't have the power to strike down legislation.
And that's even the case if the legislation quite obviously contradicts parts of the Constitution, like, say, the Bill of Rights Act. So the courts now have the ability to say, this law that you've just passed, that's actually in contravention of the Constitution, and Parliament could just go, so what?
I think there's a very strong commitment to the idea that Parliament has the final say on these matters because we have a very strong relationship with our elected representatives. We love our right to vote and things like that, and that translates to a very strong ideal of the power being vested in the Parliament and not in the courts, who we don't have the relationship with necessarily.
In fact, most New Zealanders couldn't name a Supreme Court justice in New Zealand, which actually I think is probably a good thing.
We have a lot of respect for our courts, and we respect law, and the idea that government must act consistently with law is a pretty fundamental sort of ideal in New Zealand. Respect for the law is a fundamental, but it's also vulnerable, I think, to political expediency. And Matthew Palmer wrote in the early 2000s that he worried that the rule of law and judicial independence was a vulnerable constitutional norm, and that people didn't understand, why these legal requirements on the government were imposed and what they meant in times of crunch, whether they'd favour the courts over the government. And I think there's a good question to ask is culturally, how strong is our commitment to the rule of law? Because that's what we're seeing being eroded and elsewhere in countries abroad, and there's instances where the Trump administration have basically signalled that they don't care what the courts say. But here in New Zealand, there's still a sense when the courts speak, and speak properly in terms of law, that will be respected by our governments and adhered to. But that's founded on an idea of the legitimacy of this important branch of the government, the judiciary.
Of people buying in to the civil contract.
And that's why we've got protection in our system, in our cabinet manual, for example, that tells ministers not to unduly criticise the actions of judges, not to interfere, because
that erodes that.
That erodes that sort of gravitas of law. And it's really important that the first and fundamental guardrail is the requirement to act through and by law. Law can be changed, and the executive can change the legal settings if they want, but they need to change that law if they want to act differently. This probably takes us back to the mid-70s, where we had one of our great constitutional moments with Muldoon purporting to suspend a law that he didn't like by press release. And in some respects, these sort of moments and memories in our history all feed into the idea of the respect for the role of the judiciary and the importance of the government acting by law. So back in the 70s, when Muldoon had campaigned on abolishing the compulsory super scheme, which was set out in legislation, came into office, announced that the scheme is being suspended. Today, payments don't need to be made. We'll pass legislation down the track next year to change the law to reflect that. A junior public servant, Mr Fitzgerald, challenged the Prime Minister suspending that law without the consent of Parliament. And what the court ruled is the executive government, the Prime Minister, he has to comply with the law.
There's one other guardrail. Whether you could hit a point where the Governor-General said, actually, no, you've gone too far, I'm not going to support that.
By long-standing practice, the Governor-General, in relation to almost all powers, exercises that power on advice of their ministers. There's a small group of powers we call the reserve powers, largely relating to the appointment of government and dissolution, where they've got the potential to exercise it independently, and that's controlled within our system.
Do you think that within the reserve powers of the Governor-General, that there is the ability for the Governor-General to step in if they believe that the government, the executive, has overstepped their constitutional boundaries?
What we know from practice is the Governor-General doesn't. It's a very, very strong constitutional convention, grounded in the idea of democracy, that when the Prime Minister and the ministers advise the Governor-General to act in a particular way, they will do so. The Governor-General has the ability to counsel and warn and even say, I'm not convinced this is a great idea, but I'm obliged to give effect to it. There is some of that soft power that lies in the Governor-General. There's a theoretical question about whether the Governor-General could refuse or act differently. And we don't see that in practice. But what we have is something different to some other jurisdictions where the Prime Minister can just sign and give legal effect to instruments and regulations and so forth in and of themselves. I think there's something about having a structural system that requires the Prime Minister and the Minister to formally advise another person
to sit down and explain to them what they're doing, why they want it. Convince them, basically.
Yeah, and it's not a high bar, because we know the practice over decades and decades and decades is the Governor-General
has always, as far as we're aware, has always agreed.
That's right, but that scintilla of doubt, at least in a theoretical sense, might have some effective conditioning power. It may mean that Prime Ministers or Ministers don't offer up advice that would be very egregious and extreme and things like that. So there's the existence of the separation of powers between formally in the Governor-General and in substance in Cabinet in some ways conditions and constrains the use of power against its successors.
Yeah, absolutely, I get that. We should just say that when we talk about government, it's not just the Cabinet or the Executive or the Prime Minister. It actually includes all of the arms of government.
The Cabinet and Ministers sits as the political executive, underneath them, a whole series of departments and officials, public servants. The important thing for us, in contrast to the US, is that we have a permanent, neutral public service.
Yeah. The executives of all of the different ministries are not like replaced with party lackeys every time there's an election.
That's right, and that's really, really important in our system because it provides a stability in the system. It generates a degree of friction because one of the key obligations of the neutral public service is to proffer free and frank advice. And that creates a degree of, as I say, friction within the system. And
there's someone there basically to professionally say, you've got to be kidding, what the heck are you thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. And that relationship with ministers and the chief executive is really important. And in our system, the Public Service Commissioner is responsible for selecting the senior public servants, the chief executives.
It's a nice step, non-political step removed.
That's right, but it's at risk because there is thinking that perhaps we should follow more of the US model or some of the Australian models that see politicians have a bigger say in the selection.
Whoever was doing the selecting, that would be a bad idea.
It reduces that sense of one of the key checks and balance that comes from that neutrality, that free and frank advice, if you're able to select people that are just heavily responsive to do your bidding.
What else have we forgotten?
Collective governance and cabinet. The Parliament, the House, expresses its confidence in the collective of ministers as a whole. So there's an interlocking sort of relationship, confidence between those ministers. Decision-making in New Zealand under the cabinet system is done collectively, round the cabinet table, including the Prime Minister.
But it's not just a single individual. They first have to convince their caucus and then they have to convince their cabinet.
That's right. And the thing is that confidence is, while it's there, it's great, but it can evaporate. And so that conditions or causes a degree of restraint on the part of Prime Minister or ministers acting to excess.
So to some extent, another guardrail is the fact that a parliamentary party can actually turf their own leader halfway through between elections.
That's right.
So you actually have to play it safe enough not to lose your job.
That's right. And that's the way that confidence is the lifeblood of everybody in the system. It's that precautionary sort of posture that avoids misuse, abuse of power or being too radical and things like that. The other side, and because it probably cuts both ways, a very good Prime Minister can control their cabinet, and a savvy Prime Minister, because decisions are made collectively, if they can dominate cabinet, they can dominate the government. But in principle, the idea of collectivism means that it's a shared power responsibility. Everybody's concerned to maintain the confidence of their colleagues and the confidence of the House of Representatives and ultimately the people.
There's a thing that occurs to me that is quite different from how some of these systems work, and that's the fact that the executive has to turn up and face the opposition and answer questions from them. I mean, we do it really badly, and some executives almost entirely avoid answering any questions. But the fact that they do have to be in the same room and publicly be seen to defend themselves does possibly act as a guardrail.
And that's a sort of a structural guardrail and processes which support this idea of confidence and responsibility of Cabinet. Yeah, the question time is a crucial time for opposition members to hold the executive government to account. I know it feels like political theatre, but it actually has a really important role in the system. It's part of the key accountability. The first obligation to accountability is to render account, and that's what happens, to explain what's going on in government, what's gone right, what's gone wrong, what's going to be fixing it. So that requirement to render account, whether it's question time, whether it's select committees through scrutiny weeks or other things like that, it has a civilising effect on the exercise of power.
That was Dr. Dean Knight, Professor of Law at Te Heranga Waka, Victoria University of Wellington. And you've been listening to The House, e te whakaranga koe ki te whare. This program is produced with funding from Parliament's Office of the Clerk. Mā te wā.